I've made this argument before in one of my recordings, but it's really worth being made again, in defense of Dave Rubin's style of interlocutorship or interview mechanics. The reason why I make this recording is because I've heard, I guess you could say, secondhand reports of it being disparaged on the left or the woke left, or at least the people that come into contact with Rebel Wisdom, which in some sense try to keep a kind of agnostic view of these things. And I've even heard from um, one of the main I don't know how to describe them, one of the main constituents of Rebel Wisdom. It's so embarrassing. I never know anyone's name. The guy with the beard, who's usually the interviewee, and usually he usually asks very incisive questions, and he moves the conversation forward, and he's actually very good at there's a lot of substantive development in a similar fashion to Dave Rubin's style. Obviously, it's a different domain. Dave Rubin is mainly focused on political ideology, political values. Rebel Wisdom is much broader and also more specific within the ambit of cultural salience, let's just say, with a perhaps a weighting towards looking for explanatory mechanics for answering deeper questions, which Dave is curious about, but he's more focused on, obviously, the culture, politics, convergence, or interrelation. Anyway, there's a lot of there is at least some general overlap between both of their spheres of interest and influence. And I've even heard the practitioner of I want to say director of Rebel Wisdom, one of the main directors of Rebel Wisdom. I'll just let me get away with that. Say that he is not happy with Dave Rubin's interlocutorship, or a style of essentially run with it, don't run against it, be a blank canvas for the interviewee. Now, I don't think Dave exactly does that, because he does direct the conversation in a positive way, not in a necessarily negative way, although he does sometimes also ask incisive questions. It's not all just a walk in the park. He doesn't press the point except to essentially defend his expressed positive contribution to the dialogue. And so he is seeing how far he can agree and try to calibrate the degree to which there is divergence and potential synthesis and potential room for him to think about shifting to, or reasons to be entrenched against the alternative. That, I think, is a positive intellectual program of development. That is what Dave is doing. But so what he is doing is authentic on the individual scale relative to Dave. it also has broader positive ramifications. It also has broader, let's say, good faith vibes. Because essentially the only thing that's missing from Dave Rubin's style of interlocutorship, which the type of disparaging and critique which is levied against him goes on to entail and describe, is that he doesn't treat people like Trojan horses. He doesn't try to debunk them. He doesn't try to play devil's advocate. He doesn't, let's say, play the hardened skeptic. Now, there are a lot of things that you simply can't get to in a dialogue, and that you can't actually intellectually discover when one plays that kind of game. Because this might be a secret to some people, but true intellectualism is not just about rationalization. It might have to be self-consistent, but that's not. I'm going to give myself a headache if I have to repeat my whole rant over the cult of introverted thinking and the cult of TI, and how introverted thinking, TI, abbreviated in cognitive function notation, is that's not actually metaphysically how TI is not this web matrix of reality rationalization which just works as you know, you just find a piece of the puzzle, you find enough pieces of the puzzle, you piece them together, and you've kind of got an outline of reality. That's not how rationality works. That's not how bits of information cannot be pieced together to make an understanding. Let me think if I can just try to summarize the point without going into the long substantiation of that claim. But essentially, logic is not what people think it is, and in fact, how pseudo-intellectuals, many of which are in the sort of the scientific community, I'll say as well, are philosophically really retarded. Essentially, I'm using that word in the dictionary definition of the original word, obviously, not the psychological clinical designation. It's still an English word. It has its uses. And perhaps I do use it liberally. I guess I'll have to worry about that if I ever become a public figure and work out how to reframe my language. But anyway, or how I should broach circumventing that really silly tightrope which has been constructed essentially to keep a pretentious, superficial facade of intellectualism that can essentially pass off the fraud of intellectualism or fraudulent intellectualism as a legitimate, plodding, sort of project of slow and steady progress and construction, which is a total lie. That's not how advancements are made. That's not how discoveries, and essentially, the corruption and the mediocrity of academia is testament to. Anyway, I don't want to get into too many tangents. Let me say that logic, the only thing that you can say when something is logical is not that it is true, is only that it is self-consistent. And self-consistency is not a self-consistent feature. So it's doubly problematic because it's fundamentally sort of, it cannot be used to track itself. It cannot be used to monitor itself. You need reason to monitor logic. And reason and logic are not the same thing. Reason is like a coherent thread of consistent sequitur this doesn't matter, I guess, if I'm not defining each of my terms. So sadly, this is not going to be on the level of the quality of a thesis. But I mean, I guess if you try to track the context and the emphasis that I'm placing on certain words, I guess. But I mean, this will be too easy for someone to interpret into nonsense. But which is sadly another manifestation of the fact that through bad faith all things are possible. And the only check to good faith is tracking the consequences of reason, essentially. But the consequences emanating from a an object of reason, as an object, and a reason for something, a particular reason for a particular something, some circumstance, or claim. I was going to have to add a lot of complexity to get into defining reason, because you can't just say it's a sequitur set of, you have to then use some convoluted jargon as well. You have to say like a sequitur set of processes, because the processes have a sequitur a sequitur ordering, which again can only be monitored by essentially the faith to which the reason appertains. Wow, this is getting so abstract. And so when you're in a real intellectual dialogue, people aren't bothered with trotting out rationalizations and rationalizations and rationalizations, because that's like the fine print. It really is. People are just stating their opinions, and the opinions get modulated essentially because the content of the opinion is not what is being tracked, it's the structure of the faith. In some sense, the opinion is a metaphor to the actual intellectual space, the real intellectual space. And it's on that level of introverted intuition that discoveries are actually made and that connections are found, and that innovation and the working out of things, how workable something is essentially is somewhat a marker of the robustness of the faith that is appended to the qualia of operation, or the qualia of operability pertaining to a particular objective reason. Oh my word. And so what is logic in all of this? Logic is a tiny subset in this whole picture of, is the reasoning self-consistent? And you can make any reasoning sound self-inconsistent by interpreting it badly or uncharitably, by essentially being agnostic about the faith that is related to it. So what's the point of even indulging in that level of skepticism? I mean, it's fucking sophistry. It's a waste of fucking time. That's for pseudo-intellectual pedants to go and play sophistry games with each other. I mean, really, that's not serious shit. That's just childs fighting in the sandbox. That's childish shit. It really is. It's beyond. I mean, grow up, and this is the quality usually of. I don't want to paint too broad a brush, but this is the kind of shall I use the stereotype, the village atheist. The philosophical skeptic who likes to trot out their formulaic just pause this while I finish my drink. Okay, so self-consistency is a piddling, stupid contention raised by people, usually people that aren't very intellectual or serious. They don't have the imagination, in some sense, to actuate or to have the intellectual charity to animate what somebody else is saying and to make it functional in the mind. And I mean, sometimes one can be too intellectually generous and see deeper into what somebody else says than what they actually meant by it, because it's been animated by a higher intellect or by an intellect that had its attention focused on other facilities within the intellectual domain, and therefore animated it a bit differently or something like that, and therefore created a curious sort of collaborative innovation almost, and which might be interesting to share and see if that might be synthesized. But I mean, self-consistency is not unimportant. The thing is that it's always incredibly context bound, and therefore pointing out something to be self-inconsistent can be fixed by mere addition to more reasoning in some sense, just by addition and perhaps also by slight augmentation. But generally, it's actually always possible to just, I mean, if your reasoning is tight enough, but yet slightly self-inconsistent, that just means it needs further elaboration by mere addition, not by significant amendment, or amendment merely by addition, not by a kind of invasive or reductive. Or when I say reductive, I mean like a jettisoning of part of the earlier reasoning. And in that sense also, I mean, all this is also up to interpretation. You could say that part of that earlier reasoning that might be jettisoned in order to solve the self-inconsistency, you can merely see that the old reasoning was a clear metaphor for the elaborated supplementation of that part of the reasoning. But self-inconsistency is obviously very important when you're trying to make something practically work now. It's not that important when you're just dealing in the realm of ideas, depending on the context of what the purpose of the discussion is, obviously. But merely essentially trying to leverage skepticism is so unenlightening, it's so uninteresting, it's so irrelevant in most of the case. I mean, you're essentially saying, I'm testing you, pass my test, because if you don't, then you will be unmasked as having bad faith, according to the principle that the test is worthy of being engaged with and surmounted, or there's a better word than that, but anyway, it's to slow down the process in some sense. But I mean sometimes people are so sloppy with their thinking, or so incoherent in their in the faith that is appended to their object of reason, so chaotic, so disjointed. But then in some sense, why are you even talking to such a person, really? Because they're not taking it seriously. They're just wasting time with their mouth, using mouth noises. And they're wasting your time by forcing you to be subjected to that kind of trash, simulating an intellectual exchange for their vanity or some shit. But okay, so let's say Rubin doesn't. Okay, now I know that this is quite abstract. I've been talking almost metaphysically in broad strokes. So let's concretize some of those broad strokes into a more social, because those are nice broad frameworks that I think I've set up. But let me get more particular. So let's say the problem with Rubin is that he doesn't bring up people's dark, controversial slights that have been mounted by their detractors, and he doesn't make them answer those charges, or when he does, he doesn't try to grill them and follow up and play devil's advocate. So let's get some objectivity about this. What does this all amount to? What does this even mean? What is the purpose and the function of this supposed to get to? So the idea is that this person sometimes says what they mean, and then they have a public face that says something different, so that as an entity they're kind of like a Trojan horse for something vile and toxic, and they have two faces and they have two sets of opinions, and therefore they also have a kind of diluted message. Therefore, um, who? I mean, what's the point of caring about this? What's the point of being invested in someone's character assassination for the fact that they have two sets of books? I mean, if they do that, I mean, frankly, I think Trojan horses. I mean, if someone can actually create a Trojan horse that's worthy of being accepted through the gates, um, then it must be crafted pretty well. But you know, if it looks a bit shoddy, if it looks like it's trying, um, but not succeeding, then I mean, obviously, leave it outside. It's ugly. It's, you know, you can perhaps get some value, some aesthetic value from a well constructed, um, aesthetically pleasing Trojan horse. Um, I mean, in some sense, I mean, this really doesn't matter, especially in on the level at which that Dave Rubin is dealing with intellectualism, because he doesn't need a group of people to count as collateral supporters, offering him collateral moral authority for his views because people supposedly agree with him. So he finds out that some people who he thought supposedly agreed with him actually hold a separate set of views on certain issues, and therefore there's actually disagreement about those issues because that person was being two-faced. Like, it's not as if the Trojan horse is is in some sense Dave Rubin wants to immediately, when he accepts the Trojan horse in, take it apart and assimilate the pieces that are aesthetically pleasing and throw away the bits that aren't. Oh, it's full of, well, if it's a shoddy Trojan horse, there's nothing of value anyway. I mean, people offer what they have to offer, and if people are going to dilute their own message by by ostensibly contenting views that they don't really hold, then I mean, well, isn't culture succeeding at suppressing them, or isn't their failure at being able to contend a contrary or controversial view a sign of their intellectual um, what's the word? I can't think of a good word, but I'll just say fragility and mediocrity. I mean, in some sense, this only matters in the world of people in which people want to collect armies of supporters to show that their side has some kind of, I said moral authority, but it's broader than moral authority. It's a kind of like a way of outsourcing a kind of existential doubt about, you know, a kind of a way of truth conduciveness, a kind of epistemological um, reliabilism, which is always toxic and the province of weak-minded people, of weak character, of virtually no moral standing. They are as superficial as they are. They are just where the world takes them. They are part of the stream. Um, uh, they are what I would describe as the kind of as the spiritual perennialists. claiming to understand everything and having no understanding of their own whatsoever, or claiming to be a part of everything and being merged with the process, or whatever. It's believing in nothing and everything simultaneously, or some such um, paradoxical thing, in which case you need to sort of to fudge your own accounting for yourself, and that's very helpful when you've got the help of collateral supporters that you sort of collect totemically. And obviously, because that's essentially what the left is, intellectually speaking. It doesn't have, or the so-called left, I should rather say, or the new left. And I won't go ranting about that now, but okay, so Dave Rubin. So he lets people off. Oh, he doesn't grill them. He doesn't put people under the fire and make them uncomfortable and watch them sweat and extract the truth from them coercively, or at least he's not willing to make bad people feel discomfort. He's not willing to take the truth from someone. Essentially, and I'll argue that the so-called use and leveraging of skepticism in order to grill people, I would argue as well, is when you take the truth from exhibition, from a kind of exhibitionism on that kind of procedure of, I mean, it's a it's a it's a foregone conclusion, because the logic being applied in the skepticism, which is devil's advocate logic, essentially you take some opposing self-consistent line of reasoning and you countervail their responses with that contradictory explanation. You compare them with a hypothetical version of themselves with this imagined alternative reasoning, which they don't openly profess to have, but which they can be perhaps rationally depicted as agreeing with in a reductive way, and extracting those reductive artifacts of alignment with the theory of the devil's advocate. This reminds me greatly, I saw this very amazing YouTube video on statistics and lies, essentially, and how I think they call it the prosecutor's fallacy. I think it kind of covers this kind of concept, probably in a. I mean, my recordings are very verbose and go on forever, and the quality of this YouTube video is actually it's very concise, it's very cogent, unlike my style, but perhaps I'll try to find that and make the link available in the description of this video, because it's worth visiting in conjunction with this point, because essentially the prosecutor's fallacy, I think, at least in metaphor, is what is being accomplished or what is being perpetrated with the use of essentially extracting this kind of exhibition. And it's a vacuous enterprise. You can say, oh no, but no, actually that's what they really do believe, so it's worth putting it to them, and it's worth trying to get them to admit to it, or at least then trying to extract some bit of pain and sweat and toil from them in defending their ostensible line, which is palpably incorrect. And that is a journalistic feat, if it can be. And in some sense, the problem is that if they don't actually openly admit it, one can, I think, very easily argue that the whole exchange was just a series of awkwardness, of engineered contrition, and a kind of acrimonious onslaught of a kind of vectored bad faith, which has gained a kind of cultural, canonical currency. And let us not forget that we are in a decadent culture of a debauched intellectual paradigm. So let us not be too unquestioning about alternative visions of engaging with interlocutorship. I mean, this is a point that I guess was even raised by Eric Weinstein on the portal, and perhaps also Brett. I think I heard Eric at least say it first, if they've both said it, that we are in the process of rediscovering and redeveloping the tools of exchange, of an engaged fora of interrelating and testing the objects of the mind without assaulting the structure, the kind of the substrate of the mind itself, in the as the byproduct of perpetuating the residue of inherited pathological cultural patterns of, I'll call them ideological mind viruses, which are like intellectual themes of what is acceptable and not acceptable as well, perhaps, and a kind of a confection of a kind of moral judgment which is not very well grounded or thought out, and that is the point of this recording, is to explore this issue. Okay, I'll probably leave it there. I wonder if I could have gone on, but I need to stop. Just to round out a philosophical point that I touched on. So the cohesion of an object of reason is represented by its faith, that appends to that object of reason. And a particular reasoning on a particular issue or thing or subject. The self-consistency of reasoning is a very tenuous sort of thing to claim, because in some sense, it's almost fictional, to tell you the truth. It's kind of that tenuous. Um, because it's highly contextual. It's like contextual to a snapshot of faith. And it cannot rightly even collate uh, between those snapshots. Because it can only look at one of those frameworks independently and then say if it's self-consistent or not self-consistent. And then you have the problem of impossible um, just trying to think what John Cleese called it. He mentioned this in his On Creativity video, uh, which had some very fine thinking on psychology in it, although focused on a very uh, select topic. But anyway, impossible middle steps. So impossible middle steps which cancel each other out, therefore cannot be followed by logic. I should have said as well that essentially the current cult around logic is largely premised on a philosophical misunderstanding about a logical axiom um, called the axiom of transitivity, which is an erroneous axiom. It's patently false. I've got recordings where I debunk it. I'm not going to rehash that. But essentially, I mean, I can depict. This doesn't depict debunking it, but I can depict essentially an example of why self-consistency and complaining about logic doesn't work is because essentially, well, if you look at a mathematical expression, you could just say, well, that's junk, you can't do anything with it, throw it out. It's got the square root of 2 in it. Um, the whole thing is useless. But if essentially you have a wider or a broader purview of the faith that is appended to that bit of reasoning, to that object of reason, um, you can say, well, I'm not done yet. Uh, and in the fullness of the faith uh, that reason is appended to, um, or that is appended to that reason, that object of reasoning, a particular that is appended to a particular reason for something. Um, I mean, this whole thing is somewhat abstract because when you're talking about reason, a reason or something like that, I mean, it's sort of, what are you even talking about? I mean, you're talking about something that is essentially the substance upon which faith pervades and is administering its style of orchestration over its medium of expression. In some sense, reason is only the face, the visage of a particular comportment of a faith, of someone's faith. There is no reason without a living mind. So to talk about reason, you are already sort of depending on a context, on a robust context, in which you know, it's like saying, well, what does the, oh, I wish I could remember it. You know, like what does this component do? You know, it's so weird looking. It's so weirdly shaped. You know, and you don't even know what that component goes towards compiling and making up, and you've got all this litany and all this, you know, sort of strangely obtuse treatment of what must be about this component when it's merely a functioning aspect of a greater dynamism. And that greater dynamism in this context, talking about faith, is something that is essentially contending a purport that is another layer of context, which is essentially, in a technical way, is robbed of the. It's somewhat. It's not. It should be. It should be regarded as being implied by the. When one is speaking about reason, it should be implied that it comes appended with essentially a purport, that it has a context. Otherwise, it's not reasoning. It's just some bit of rubbish logic. And if it's not even self-consistent, I mean, how could you even, in fact, know if it was self-consistent or not? You could talk about it appearing to be self-consistent or not. Anyway, I'm not going to get into my argument about how machine learning is all fundamentally, or how people talk incorrectly about what is happening in machine learning. But anyway, so moving on. Self-consistency takes a snapshot of faith in order to make that reading of self-consistency. And in some sense, as again, that can be a useful tool for potential, let's say, augmentation, innovation, unfolding. But when it's used destructively, merely to kind of second guess, to play devil's advocate, I mean, it's using the tool to, in some sense, upend purportedness to essentially try to insert or assert a kind of gainsaid rationalization that then gets sort of justified post hoc because you can't negate it or escape some dilemma that's being thrown at you or something like that. Um, and again, I can hear the chorus of, no, but it's, no, but you need to do it because it is actually true in this case. And this person needs to be shown up. We need to see the blood. Uh, we want to see the fireworks. We need vindication of their true intentions. And it's essentially, we need to pin our projection of what people need to be understood to having intended in their operation and in their thinking, so that our categorical worldview can be essentially reified, or solidified, concretized, vindicated. That's generally what's happening in the sort of in the woke crowd. Um, and on some level of intellectualism, there are, let's say, authentic people who engage in this level of intellectualism, and it's not quite the same as how I just described it, because in some sense everyone is trying to scurry on the life raft that has the best view and has the best sort of rations kept on it or something like that, and it's a battle, and so you're going to jump off your raft so that you can swim to a new one, and it's just it's almost a kind of musical chairs of uh, which platform has the greatest dominion and authority to wield over the others. And so when one person is defeated on the grounds of not being self-consistent or being so-called illogical, then they get to sort of upgrade their position to a more so-called logical one, and then they can say, well, now logic is on my side, so I can't be wrong, and then they go and attack other people on the implements that logic have granted them. They effectively become mind slaves to this mind virus. So again, the utility of logic is its let's say useful ingredient in the developmental process of cultivating syntheses and innovation, and perhaps creative destruction as well, of parts of old reasoning that can be revised perhaps, or by a kind of supplementary augmentation, in part or in large sections or segments. The problem is that when you're using logic, it's never holistic, and so it's a cutting tool. It's not really a sewing tool, and so everything that you cut down with it has to be sewn up with reason. And if the sewing reasoning that's sewing things up is sort of in this cultish diminutization in relation to the logic, it's because it's so afraid of being outshone, or it's so afraid of being cut again, then it sort of huddles together with other such wary survivors to bandy together to create some sort of bandwagon of collaborated defense or security I'm not describing this well, security sort of pact and sort of and tribe and claim to being the representative of the logical authority, and to shower themselves in the trinkets and trappings of and the garb and the vestiges of authority. This is what in the Gita are referred to as the miscreants, that have certainly made a home in this era and this epoch, cultivating to themselves many, to use a biblical scripture, many who have itching ears, hurriedly listening to those who tend to their false teachings and their flocks of adherent, blinded, I'll use the word again, miscreants. Because these people have not merely been misled, they have been misled to the point to which that they now love the darkness. They love their spiteful ways and their ideological vengeance and their protection racket. And then they disparage people like Dave Rubin for breaking their authoritative mold. I mean, in some sense, this recording is more addressed to perhaps that guy in Rebel Wisdom, but also to clarify this point in broader spiritual, metaphysical, or philosophical terms. Okay, well, I guess that does now fully deal with the subject, I believe.